Good evening, everybody. My name is Mike Barsanti, and I am the Edwin Wolf II Director of the Library Company of Philadelphia. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you here tonight, or welcome you wherever you are. Welcome you to this virtual opening of our latest exhibition, Imperfect History, or to give it its full title, Imperfect History, Curating the Graphic Arts Collection at Benjamin Franklin's Public Library. I'm really pleased to be joined tonight by the curators of the exhibition. We have Sarah Weatherwax, our Senior Curator of Graphic Arts, Erica Piola, the Curator of Graphic Arts and Director of the Visual Culture Program, and Kanaya Hassan, who was one of the third curator in the program, joining us from afar in her new work. I want to, in addition to thanking all of you for coming, we're going to be hearing a lot about the exhibition and the work that went into it. As you hear Erica, Sarah, and Kanaya talk about the exhibition, keep in mind this is an exhibition that was developed to celebrate the 50th anniversary of what we now call the Graphic Arts Department. And I think one of the things that makes this an especially interesting and courageous exhibition is that it does not do what one might expect. It doesn't focus on the greatest hits of the collection or telling the grand story of the glories of its collection and its highlights, but instead takes more of a behind the scenes curatorial view at what are some of the issues raised by the nature of the collection and by the people who shaped it. Where are the gaps? Where are the missing pieces? Where are the what areas of strength reflect underlying areas of weakness behind them? And I think it's the subtlety of that presentation and the carefulness of the curation that makes this an especially important exhibition for the library company. It was always part of Erica, Sarah, and Kanaya's vision that this exhibition be be seen in the light of the upcoming 300th anniversary of the library company and the long history of this institution. Before handing over the microphone to the curators, I want to thank some of our donors for tonight. I want to thank the Walter J. Miller Trust. I want to thank the Center for American Art at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. I see that Kathy Foster is out there in the audience tonight. J. Robert Stiefel, the Terra Foundation for American Art. You can hear my dog in the background. Welcome to COVID. She really wants a part of this. But I really especially want to thank the Henry Luce Foundation, who are the prime supporters of this. Those of you who get to come to the library company will get to see the fantastic catalog that their support has allowed. Their support also allowed us to hire Kanaya and to have her work for the time on this exhibition. And I'm really pleased that Terry Carboni from the Luce Foundation, the director of the program in American Art, is here tonight as well. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Erica and Sarah and Kanaya, and look forward to a great evening. Thanks again.
Thanks, Mike. Sarah's going to be our next speaker, and I'm going to share the screen again. So if you could just give me a moment.
Great. Thank you, Erica. I would like to echo Mike's welcome to all of you who are joining us this evening. Since we are not on site and able to view the exhibition in person, before we start the roundtable discussion, we wanted to begin this evening with an exhibition overview and to step back even more to provide you with a brief history of the Graphic Arts Department. We will also take a few minutes to acknowledge those who made the project possible, from library company staff members to freelance professionals to our generous funders whom Mike just mentioned. We hope to get all of the above accomplished in the next half hour or less. So without further ado, I'm going to launch into a brief overview of graphics collecting at the library company. As many of you know, the beginnings of the library company date back to 1731. And it was an outgrowth of the meetings of Benjamin Franklin and about 50 friends who formed a mutual improvement society called the Junto. Junto members pooled their resources to purchase primarily books for all the Junto members to share, but graphics also entered the collection in these early years through both purchases and gifts. Since the focus of the library company was on the book collection, it's not surprising, however, that books were more systematically included in our institutional records and public catalogs. It takes a close reading of our institutional archives to tease out what graphics we owned. We found the references to John Mitchell's enormous 4-foot by 5-foot 1755 map, not in our 1757 catalog of books, but rather it was included in a narrative called A Short Account of the Library, which contained a list of the non-books owned by the library company. Other items on the list included a 12-foot long snakeskin, a camera obscura, and a mirror. For those of you who are looking closely at my slide, you'll notice that the copy of the Mitchell map included here is actually from the Library of Congress. The library company still does have its copy, but it has not yet been digitized. Next slide, please. In the late 18th century, the library company purchased much of the contents of Pierre Eugene de Cimetiere's Philadelphia Museum upon his death in 1785. Contemporary library company records describe this material as books, manuscripts, and publications. But in actuality, a good number of graphics entered the collection at this time, including the political cartoon related to the Stamp Act that you see here. Political cartoons would become one of the strengths of the graphics collection throughout our centuries of collecting. Next. Two collections that came into the library company in the 19th century became the core of our graphics holdings. Charles Poulsen, son of a former library company librarian, compiled a series of scrapbooks filled with newspaper clippings, drawings, prints, manuscripts, and photographs, and left them as a bequest to the library in 1866. The 2 pages from Poulsen's scrapbooks shown here include some of the earliest paper photographic views of Philadelphia. Next. 20 years later, in 1886, Philadelphia antiquarian John A. McAllister presented over 50,000 pieces of ephemera to the library company, including many graphic items. The small selection seen here are all featured in the Imperfect History exhibition. Next. In the early 1950s, the library company reinvented itself as a research library. We moved to our current location on Locust Street in Center City, Philadelphia in the spring of 1966, and the new building included a dedicated space specifically for graphics on the 2nd floor. Today, we continue to maintain a reading room and storage space on the 2nd floor. In 1971, a separate graphics department was established, and the first curator of the collection was hired. Over the next 50 years, 4 people have led the department, and their interests and knowledge have influenced what we collect and the department's activities. Next. Beginning in the mid-1970s and into the early 1990s, under the leadership of 2 successive curators with a particular interest in photography, inventorying, cataloging, and exhibiting the photography collection became a priority, leading to some very popular exhibitions and publications as the richness of that portion of the collection revealed itself. Next. As we entered the 1990s and early 2000s, the digital revolution arrived at the library company. Here you see Erica Piola creating online catalog records for graphic materials. Erica has barely changed over the last 2 decades, but I'm happy to say that our computers have all gotten much smaller. Next. In the 21st century, projects in the graphic arts department have been well balanced between different types of material in the collection. Philadelphia on Stone built on the library's strong collection of Philadelphia lithographs and culminated in a book, an exhibition, and an online database. Catching a Shadow pulled together daguerreotypes in our collection, as well as other institutional holdings for an exhibition exploring early Philadelphia photography. And the Remnants of Everyday Life exhibition featured our growing ephemera holdings. Next. Today, the graphic arts department consists of approximately 100,000 items, including maps, cased photographs, drawings and watercolors, architectural plans, lithographs, engravings, photographs, and ephemera. Our collecting focus is on Philadelphia views and the work of Philadelphia photographers, printers, and artists, but we also collect more broadly in areas including African American history, economic history, visual culture, and women's history. We continue to add to the collection through gifts and purchases, and the staff assists researchers using graphic items, as well as pursuing our own research interests through presentations and publications. I'm now going to turn the program over to my colleague, Erica Piola.
Thank you, Sarah. I have to say that sweater that I'm wearing in 2000, I still have that sweater. So I now know how old that sweater is. So thank you, Sarah. I also want to say, as Mike so nicely introduced me, I am Erica Piola, and I'm not only the curator of graphic arts, but also the director of the visual culture program. With that hat on for the moment, I wanted to quickly introduce the program because its mission so closely relates to many of the themes of the Imperfect History exhibition, which we will introduce to you in just a few minutes. With a mission to promote visual literacy, the visual culture program supports the creative use of historical images as primary sources for studying the past, the history of our social construction of the visual, and the mass visual culture of the nation before 1950. Through exhibitions, research fellowships, and I just want to quickly say that we'll have 3 VCP fellowships for 2022. So if anyone in the audience wants to apply for one, please do. Publications, acquisitions, digital projects, and public programs. The Visual Culture Program fosters research, collection, and interpretation of historical visual material. Visual culture and visual literacy is inherent to the conception of the Imperfect History exhibition. Imperfect History makes visible the often unseen people, places, meanings, and aesthetics, the hidden lives of the pictorial records representing the library's company's distinct and multifaceted history. The exhibition showcases the complexity of these materials and their stories, and how they are fundamental to acquiring the visual literacy skills necessary to understand our nation's complicated history. The exhibition is divided into 6 sections: inception, collection, reception, reading the graphic arts collection. As time goes by, snapshots of the evolution of the graphic arts collection, 1731 to 2021. What curators love to hate and hate to love. Imperfection section, curatorial space in place, and made you look, 3 curators' perspectives on the graphic arts. The exhibition also includes a behind-the-scenes video of the making of the exhibition and timelines of events related to the history of graphic collecting at the library, as well as highlight moments for the graphic arts department, originally the print department. We hope that in the future, some of you will be able to see the exhibition in person. But for tonight, as a substitute, I, Sarah, and Kanaya will each provide brief overviews of each section. As Julie Andrews has sang, let us start at the beginning. In section 1, inception, collection, reception, reading the graphic arts collection. From soon after the establishment of the library company in 1731, the institution acquired graphic artworks from library members and patrons to foster a literate society with books and visual materials. And as noted by scholars of reading, before you can learn to read, you need to learn to look. Reading a graphic artwork does not only involve looking at its visual content. One must also consider its inception, collection, and reception. When the visual material is historical, the period in which it was created and acquired, and the periods of time of when it was viewed in the past and present is part of that interpretive process. Visual literacy is essential to be an engaged citizen. It is a safeguard to understand what we see today and a tool to understand what was seen by those previously. Through a selection of graphic materials received by the library company over its first 2 centuries as a public library, inception, collection, reception invites you to look closely and think about how you see, value, and understand your visual world and how the generations before you saw, valued, and understood it. Within this section are an empty frame to symbolize our quote unquote lost first graphic item received by the library from Thomas Penn in 1733, trade card advertisements given in 1883 by our first recorded female donor, Jewish philanthropist Emily Phillips, A collection received about the period when the library had 2 women recorded on staff. Library assistant Elizabeth McClellan, who was white, and custodial worker Margaret Gibbs, who was Black. As well as this album compiled by Black Philadelphian Richard D. Venning, a government worker descended from the relationship of a North Carolina merchant, Richard Cogdell, and Sarah Sanders, an enslaved girl in his household. It was given in 2012 by women descendants of the family. All of these materials are displayed with questions for their viewers to think about: why our first graphic artwork to the collections is unlocated, how the advertisements visualize Philip's life and the lives of those who worked at LCP when received, and how the Venning album, compared to a scrapbook received in the 19th century, represents how the content of our graphic arts collections has evolved over the centuries, or not really, and why or why not. Section 2, as time goes by, snapshots of the evolution of the graphic arts collection, 1731 to 2021, complements Section 1 and tries as best as possible to cram nearly 300 years of collection building into 1¼ walls and 4 cases to show how the stewardship and content of the graphic arts collection at the Library Company has evolved with the institution over its history. Founded as a subscription library in the 18th century, the Library Company was the largest public library in America during the 19th century. By the mid-20th century, the institution transformed into a research library. Through the 21st century, exhibitions, subject-based academic programs such as the Visual Culture Program, and the digital world have further influenced the growth and management of the library and its collections, as Sarah had discussed. Over this time, tens of thousands of visual materials have been given, purchased, and found in the holdings. In response, a graphic arts department was established in 1971. In 50 years, as Sarah's noted, 4 curators have headed the department, which they and their staffs have overseen prints, photographs, original works of art, and ephemera that were acquired before and by them. These works of popular art, conceived, circulated, consumed, collected, arranged, and described over nearly 3 centuries, are windows on the visual culture of multiple different eras. In this section, visual materials acquired before and after the establishment of the department provide snapshots of the scope and unconscious and conscious biases affecting the continual evolution and historical meanings of the graphic arts collection. This narrative is explored through subsections like Keep It, Kept It, Put It in a Scrapbook, The More Things Change, The More They Stay the Same, and Women in the Graphic Arts Collection, which includes an album of cyanotype photographs by amateur photographer Maria Dickinson Logan. Logan, a descendant of James Logan, secretary to William Penn, created the album on display as a tool to document and advocate for the preservation of her ancestral Germantown homes, Loudon and Stenton. Given to us in the 1980s, it was one of our first documented collected works of art that was by a female creator. The photos created by Logan, a white woman from a privileged background, were done in a user-friendly process that was also used to create a group portrait photograph of other members of the Venning family, relatives of the previously mentioned Richard D. Venning, including likely his niece, school principal, and first African-American graduate of the Philadelphia Girls High School and Normal School, Miranda C. Venning. The latter, given in 1991, is on display in the subsection, The More Things Change, The More They Stay the Same, and juxtaposed with racist caricatures of Black Philadelphians in our collection. Some in our holdings since at least the 1890s to further elucidate how our collections visually speak with each other in harmony and dissonance to understand the history of the library and its graphic materials in informing and preserving the nation's visual culture. I now return the virtual floor over to Sarah, who will talk about sections 3 and 4 from the exhibition.
Thanks, Erica. The next 2 exhibition sections explore the role of a curator and some of the behind-the-scenes work that goes on in caring for and expanding the collection. In What Curators Hate to Love and Love to Hate, we reveal that curators do play favorites. One of the duties of a curator is to make decisions about what materials should become part of their collection. A curator shapes the future contents of the collection they steward by creating documents that outline a cohesive focus for acquisitions. But a curator is also responsible for all of the items acquired by their predecessors, regardless of whether they fit into the current collecting scope. Personal interests of the curator, institutional priorities, current and anticipated trends in scholarship, and financial considerations also all play a role in deciding what is acquired for the collection. Curators do have favorite items and those that they have had to learn to tolerate. Next. Curators have a multitude of reasons for why they like or dislike material in the collection. I hate to admit that I love the formulaic turn-of-the-century certificates produced by publisher James Vickroy, as seen on the right. The library company owns about a dozen of these certificates, and in all of them, the artwork is mediocre, the visual narratives are very simplistic, and I feel like I should be too sophisticated to like them, but I just love the colorful jumble of each sheet. It is a little harder to admit that you dislike items in the collection, but this hippopotamus print has tormented me for years and has earned my dislike. The hippo print and about a dozen other hippo-related images came to the library company in 1991, but the collection went uncatalogued, and therefore there was no paper trail revealing where they were physically located in storage. I have lost and then found this collection more times than I want to admit, and it has come to represent the collection's management challenges a curator faces when items are not well documented. The next section is imperfections sections. Imperfections in graphic art that might be seen as diminishing the aesthetic appeal or importance of an item in an art museum can be viewed as actually enhancing the research value of a work in a special collections library, such as the library company. Artistic or printing errors can teach us about how an item was created or the relative importance ascribed to it. Added inscriptions, while sometimes visually distracting, can provide invaluable historical information. Damage or deterioration can tell us about how an item was displayed or used and helps us understand what the item meant to its owner. All of these perceived flaws provide us with a greater understanding of the graphic as a whole, beyond what is pictured in the image, as the works on display demonstrate. Next. Here we have examples of two different types of imperfections. On the right, we have the collection item with obvious condition issues. Curators have to weigh out whether poor condition is reason enough not to acquire an item, or whether its research potential outweighs its apparent flaws. The early 19th century drawing of Philadelphia's Center Square not only provides information about the city's waterworks located in the square, but also includes numerous later additional manuscript notes, where we learn about the presence of a gambling house at the square, and where the body of a murder victim was found in the winter of 1813. The stains and Scotch tape on the watercolor did not deter me from wanting to acquire this. And fortunately, we were able to send it out for conservation. So what you're seeing on the slide is the pre and post-conservation views of the item. On the left of the slide, we have a modest photographic postcard, one of more than 250 in the library's collection, taken by amateur Philadelphia photographer John Frank Keith. Few of Keith's photographs include any identifying information, so handwritten notes such as we see on this image are not a flaw or an imperfection, but are in fact a welcome source of additional information for researchers. We have been able to build biographies of many of his identified sitters, including Walt Wright, and to place them in specific Philadelphia neighborhoods, which allows us to think in new ways about Keith and his relationship to the subjects of his photographs and the ties among the sitters themselves. Our former curatorial fellow, Kanaya Hassan, will now introduce you to the two remaining sections of the exhibition.
Thank you, Sarah. So the first section is titled Curatorial Space and Place. A group of newly arrived enslaved Africans stand on an auction block on a city street, awaiting their fate. An incarcerated white man imagines an enslaved family trekking toward their freedom in the aftermath of the Emancipation Proclamation while reckoning with his own captivity. An African-American woman calls out to a white photographer taking images of her home, resisting what she sees as an unwelcome encroachment into her daily life. The scenes that the graphic materials in this section depict and the interpretations that they evoke are varied. When looking at them, we are prompted to consider the social conditions that structured Philadelphians' everyday experiences of urban space. These images also reflect the perspectives of the people who made and collected them. The way that we describe and memorialize these spaces is also a fundamental piece of the historical paradigm. So the image on the left was taken by George Mark Wilson, a white amateur photographer working in the early 20th century. Thanks to manuscript notes that Wilson wrote on the back of the photograph, we now know the circumstances that led to its creation. As I mentioned before, Wilson notes that he was primarily interested in documenting the home that's featured in the image, but encountered resistance from the African-American woman to whom it belonged. Their interaction, which results in the woman eventually obliging Wilson, illustrates the fraught tension between race and urban space in Philadelphia. The image on the right is a studio portrait of a young upper middle class Black woman. I included this photograph in this section because it exemplifies how the space of the photography studio in urban centers like Philadelphia became an important arena in which well-off African Americans during the late 19th century asserted their newfound status, which was in part a response to the proliferation of racist imagery during this time period. Next slide. The other section that I was able to curate is entitled Made You Look, 3 Curators' Perspectives on the Graphic Arts. One of the aims of Imperfect History is to consider the role of the curator, which is constantly evolving. At the library company, our main responsibilities are to care for and interpret collection objects. While these tasks sound straightforward, they're complicated and highly subjective. With 3 curators in the graphic arts department, each of whom bring their varied personal, educational, and professional backgrounds to the table, and nearly 100,000 objects, there are a myriad of perspectives that can emerge in the process of interpretation. The visual materials in this section are multi-layered and complex. There are many lenses through which one can assess them. By asking my colleagues Erica and Sarah to provide labels for each object to juxtapose with my own, I hope to illuminate the fruitfulness of considering multiple viewpoints, whether they are disparate or overlapping. I also hope that seeing our different perspectives can allow you to consider your own. The image on the left is a watercolor by William Russell Birch that depicts Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg leading a group of Indigenous leaders on a tour of the Old City neighborhood in Philadelphia. Reimagined by the artist based on written and oral accounts of the tour, the painting represents the fractured nature of the historical record, which frequently omits Indigenous perspectives. Meanwhile, the image on the right is a lithograph that was likely meant to be part of a larger print. While this print showcases the prosperity generated by the cultivation of cotton, we do not know the broader context in which it was supposed to exist, which in turn affects our respective interpretations of the object. So with that brief summary, I will pass things over back to Erica. Thank you. Oh, back to Sarah, sorry.
That's okay. Thanks, Kanaya. And finally, before we begin the roundtable discussion, I want to extend our appreciation for the many, many people who contributed to making our Imperfect History exhibition and tonight's event possible. On a personal note, I want to express my gratitude to my fellow curators, Erica Piola and Kanaya Hassan, who for the last 2 years have worked tirelessly on Imperfect History, despite facing obstacles we never could have imagined when we began the project. For more than a year, because of the pandemic, we each primarily worked from home. We met via Zoom, we shared documents through Google Drive, we used digital files in lieu of being with the actual collection. It was a challenging process, but ultimately a rewarding one. An exhibition curator, or in this case, curators, however, are just the tip of the iceberg of all the people behind the scenes making an exhibition happen. On the library company staff, I'd like to thank Mike Bersanti, our director, for supporting the Imperfect History project, and Rachel Hammer, Chief Development Officer, who helped us secure funding for the entire multifaceted project. Emily Smith, our digitization and rights coordinator, digitized every item in the exhibition for the online version, which will go live in mid-October, and took the gallery shots that we shared with you in the PowerPoint. Tristan Don, our system librarian, promptly updates our Imperfect History website. Linda August, the Graphic Arts Department Visual Materials Cataloger, patiently edited and proofread our labels over and over. Katie Maxwell, our visitor services and design coordinator, created some of the exhibition's marketing materials. And our conservation staff, Jennifer Rosner, Andrea Krupp, and Alice Austin, matted and framed items and did a beautiful job in installing the exhibition in the gallery. Beyond the library company staff, we were once again fortunate to work with Barb Barnett, who designed the gallery exhibition and promotional materials, as well as designing the accompanying book of essays by Kanaya, Erica, and I. Grace Chi is creating the online exhibition. Preston Link painted the gallery and built a new exhibition case for us. And Peter Shea installed our vinyl lettering. We also had the pleasure of working with the film company Watch Me Rise, including Nick Justice and Kevin Kurtz, who over the course of the last year filmed us as we worked on the exhibition and talked about our vision of imperfect history. That film can be viewed in the exhibition gallery and will also be part of the online version. And in many ways, I have saved the most important thank you to the end. Without the financial support of our funders, we would not, we would not have been able to launch Imperfect History. The Henry Luce Foundation, the Walter J. Miller Trust, the Center for American Art, Philadelphia Museum of Art, J. Robert Stiefel, and Terra Foundation for American Art have all generously supported various aspects of the Imperfect History project. Specifically, the Henry Luce Foundation supported the exhibition, the publication, Kanaya Hassan's curatorial fellowship, and 2 events, including tonight's program. And I am delighted to be able to publicly thank them for their steadfast support as we navigated our way through the pandemic landscape. I'm now going to turn the virtual podium over to Terry Carbone, the Program Director for American Art at the Henry Luce Foundation, to say a few words.
Thank you. I'm so happy to join you all this evening to share greetings from the Luce Foundation and to congratulate everyone on the opening of Imperfect History. I'd like to thank the library company's project leads, Sarah and Erica, for conceiving a complex and multi-layered and compelling project, and Rachel for bringing it to Luce for consideration. We deeply appreciated their proposition that even the most long-standing collections at venerable institutions have the capacity to catalyze and be central to critical consideration that paves the way for meaningful narrative change. We appreciated the role that they envisioned for Kanaya and read her postings with interest. And we also appreciated their inclusion of a multiplicity of voices from outside the organization and the linkage to the visual culture program. As by way of a little commercial for the foundation and for those thinking of projects, more than ever, we seek to support museums in their role as forums for art-centered conversations that celebrate creativity, explore difference, and seek common ground. So again, congratulations to everyone. It's a great project.
Thank you so much, Terry, and thank you so much, Sarah, for your early remarks. I'm going to share the screen again quickly, hoping. Apparently not as quickly as I hoped. There we go. I'm sorry, I have to show this roundtable visual. I am smitten with it, I have to say. So again, thank you, and Sarah and Terry. And it is now my pleasure to serve as this evening's moderator and to introduce Shawn Michelle Smith and the format of tonight's roundtable. First, we are thrilled tonight to be able to have a conversation with Dr. Shawn Michelle Smith, who is Interim Dean of Faculty and Professor of Visual and Critical Studies at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Dr. Smith is also a writer, artist, and curator who studies the history and theory of photography through the lens of race and gender. She has published 7 books, including the award-winning Photographic Returns, Racial Justice, and the Time of Photography, and At the Edge of Sight, Photography and the Unseen. She's also contributed essays to American Art, Aperture, African American Review, NKA Journal of Contemporary African Art, and the Yale Journal of Criticism. Additionally, she has been awarded a number of fellowships, including from the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum Research Center and the Schoenberg Center for Research in Black Culture. Dr. Smith also serves on the editorial boards of American Art, Journal of Visual Culture, and Photography and Culture. Our hope for the remainder of the evening is for us all to engage in a convivial, insightful, and an interesting conversation. To start this dialogue, I will pose a question to all of us panelists, and then one specifically for Dr. Smith. We then ask you to please respond with any questions or thoughts in the Q&A panel, which you can find in the lower end of the screen. We do ask for you to please use the Q&A feature as opposed to unmuting yourself to ask a question. Thank you. Okay, all right. So to begin, I thought I would ask a question playing off the title of the exhibition, and I thought that would be appropriate. So that said, history is imperfect, and so are archives in their creation, collection, and reading. What does that mean to us as curators who work with graphic materials? And I open the floor up. And I can answer myself first if others do not want to open up the floor. I actually am totally fine. I can pose the first question and to answer it. When I'm thinking about graphics and their imperfections, so to speak, as a graphics curator, I think one of those imperfections is that people see graphics as simple and not primary resources of research. And they see them as only being seen as opposed to something that can be read like a text. And I think that is part of their imperfection in historical understanding. I also don't think of imperfection as a pejorative for graphics or for any kind of archival materials or for our history. I kind of see it as starting a jumping off point for us to learn more and not idealizing our history. And I think that just makes it even more meaningful, and it adds the human element to our history and the archives. And the creation of graphic art is, people with their imperfections are a part of that creation from beginning to end. So the creating, us receiving it into our collection, and us, reading it. Like I said, it's more than just seeing. It's you're reading a graphic to understand it and see what's not only within the content, but also within the margin. So I kind of think that is also another imperfection, is that sometimes what is not seen in the print or photograph or original work of art is just as meaningful as what is seen. And I think that kind of hit home to me again today. Tanya Sheehan, who was one of our guest catalogers for the Imperfect History digital catalog, she had a blog post that we distributed today. So it's my little plug for the digital catalog and also for Tanya's blog post, where she talks about that, where it's important to look beyond the margin, the edges of a graphic material, and to understand it beyond just what is its central focus, the central image. I also have my little notes here, as you can say, but the part of that, I think it also helps us to accept images, not only on art on our terms, but on their terms themselves, so kind of humanizing the graphic material as well. Just one other kind of a last thought that I have in thinking of myself as a curator and my own imperfections or my own biases is that, it's discussed when we were conceptualizing the exhibition, is that, a graphic that I looked at 5 years ago, I read it in a very different way than what I see it today versus what I would read it, 5, 10, 15 years from now. And I think that speaks to my, growth, or maybe my non-growth as a curator, and, my period, the period of time in my career and in my life, and how that subjectiveness, how that affects my reading the graphic. So yeah, that's sort of my take on the title and imperfection in my curatorial work. And I will hand over the discussion. I see Kanaya and Sarah both are unmuted, so I don't know if they have some thoughts.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I think the benefit of the curatorial fellowship, I kind of got to jump in right into the thick of things without very much familiarity with the collection or the library company's history. And I think that speaks to what you had mentioned, Erica, about the issue of subjectivity, because I think I was looking at materials and kind of, absorbing them in a way that's very different from you and Sarah, who had worked with them very frequently and had become very familiar with the objects. And I just enjoyed that process of like coming to you, Erica, when I was cataloging something, or speaking to you both about picking objects for the exhibition. And I would notice certain things and kind of be surprised at, these sort of curious histories that a lot of these objects have. And seeing those disparate interpretations was really fruitful and really amazing to me. And then I also think it points to the importance of our role, because we mediate people's experiences with the objects. I think like because I came from sort of this outsider perspective, I was very hyper aware of how someone from the audience might see this out of context, and how some of the material might be kind of shocking, or they might not fully grasp. As you said, like, yes, there's this that's being depicted on the page or depicted on this, in this photograph, but there's, the whole context of collecting and other, institutional histories that surround it. And so it is sort of our job to elucidate that for viewers. And so I really appreciated that about the process. And it was very imperfect, but in a really great way and in a really productive way.
Yeah, I think I was thinking of this question a little bit, from a larger perspective, was just thinking about how we need as curators to be aware that the archive that we are responsible for is in itself imperfect, not just the individual items within it, but the archives does not necessarily it does not represent the complete history of anything. It represents what specific people decided was important at any given time. And I think that's something that sometimes, institutional archives just take on such a importance in many people's minds, that's the definitive description of something, that represents everything someone needs to know about a topic. And it certainly does not. And I think as a curator, something that both Erica and Kanaya, touched on, our role as, even though I hate the word gatekeeper, I don't want to be a gatekeeper, but it is our job to somehow make this material as accessible to people in as many ways as possible. And, and we have to be very aware of how we're describing things and, our biases as we describe or make decisions about what material we want to include in the collection. And I know that, I've been at the library company for a very long time, over 25 years, and it was a very exciting part of Imperfect History for me to know that I could look at material that I thought I knew pretty well, and at least in part, because of Kanaya's questions or because of Erica's questions or our discussions, look at it in a new way, that it is possible to view differently material that you think you are really, really familiar with.
Yeah, and I want to give Shawn a chance to speak, obviously, as our special guest, but just what you were saying, Sarah, made me think, again, like going back to our conceptualizing the exhibition, about how us looking at the evolving role of the curator from a connoisseur from many decades ago to a teacher. So I think you're like not only mediating our patrons or an audience, but sort of like teaching ourselves again, when we're working those materials. That from what you were saying, that just made me think that, and I will now turn over the floor to Shawn. So I would love to hear what your thoughts are about the question.
Yes, when I was thinking about this question, I think I was thinking very much along the same lines that Sarah was thinking. And so I was thinking about the partial nature of the archive, right? And so it is imperfect because it's partial in two different ways. Like, one, it's always incomplete by definition, right? So it is only a part of the picture. And then I think it's also partial in the sense of bias, being partial to some perspectives over others. And I think that this is something that you all have done such a nice job of drawing out in the way you've curated the collection for this exhibition. And so, I was thinking, how then does this influence the work of researchers, coming to archives and doing work in collections? And I think that, one of the most basic and important things to do is try to just keep that partiality, that partial view, very prominent in one's mind when one is approaching materials. And so to keep the specificity of the objects that one is looking at. And I think in a lot of the questions that Erica alluded to in the introduction of the exhibition are things that are important to just keep in mind when you're looking at any kind of artifact, a print, an album, a lithograph. You know, who produced it and under what conditions? You know, was it commissioned? If so, by whom and for what purpose? How did it circulate at the time? Was it, you know, meant to circulate widely in a newspaper with a national audience, or was it a photograph album meant to circulate, you know, in a much smaller circle of intimates, right, of family and friends? Did it have the circulation that it was intended to, or did it not? So, you know, what was its purpose, role, and function at the time that it was created, and did that purpose then change over time? And I think that it's really interesting to think about under what terms did it then enter the archive, and did its entrance into the archive change its meaning? And, you know, in that context, I think it's really interesting to think about something like the Venning album that presumably was made for sentimental and personal issues, and what does it mean when it enters the institutional space of the archive and can be seen by a much you know, broader audience and is contextualized in relation to other representations. And so that's something that I think I might want to return to. I'm also interested in, so thinking about, you know, of course, these objects in the moment that they were produced in their historical context, but then also can these images and documents be viewed differently today? And I think you all have also touched on that. So can something that was produced under one set of circumstances actually be used as evidence to tell another kind of story today? And I'm really interested in that possibility and when that becomes a possibility in the archive. So to think a little bit more about partiality in terms of bias, I think that, you know, an archive has power, and it also reproduces relations of power, again, by preserving the records and representations and perspectives of some and not others. But I think even at that, there's always messiness and contradiction in the archive as well, so that it's never univocal or monolithic or uniform. And so I love some of the juxtapositions that you have put together in the exhibitions. I loved Kanaya's project to have 3 different curators, you know, give their point of view and perspective on and on a single image or print. And I think that that gets at the ways that any given artifact can have multiple meanings, right? So even the individual print might mean very different things according to who is viewing it. So I think it's really important to think about, you know, the power relations in an archive as important and established, but also as moving and changeable as well.
Thank you, Shawn. I know I said, like, you know, to begin the roundtable, I was then going to ask a question specifically to Shawn, but I just wanted to respond a little bit to some of what you said. Like the Stephen Cogdell Sander Venning album that you mentioned, and sort of how, you know, coming into the institution, how it's you know, understanding changes from like when, you know, when it was a family archive versus now it becomes an institutional archive. And this was something that Kanaya also did a blog post about, is that even the album itself, when it was initially compiled by, Richard DeRee Venning, by the time we got it, photos had been removed. Had become inserted. Who knows where, his original order was no longer intact. And so that sort of, changes the meeting even before it gets into the institution. And then recently in preparation for the exhibition, we had our conservators, so they, to have the album be as stabilized as possible, made some decisions about like maybe it's time, to insert photos back into slots. It seemed like that's where there was a fit. And so I was mindful. I was like, okay, we're making this decision with the album. It's sort of changing. We're making a kind of another curatorial decision and potentially changing, the meaning of it again. But we took a record of like, hey, these were like the loose photographs that now is wound up in like, slot A on page 5. So that, I just thinking about what you were saying, that just, some thoughts that came to my mind about that. And like I said, I have also a blog post talking about the messiness of the Stevens Cogdell Sanders Venning album. So I would, hopefully people will go look at our blog post if they haven't already at this point. So that was, just a, oh, Sarah, yes, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that also raises the interesting question or thought of, when a family archives comes to an institutional archives, we also have to be cognizant of the fact that the family may have removed things that they don't want to have included in the public eye, that in some way they have predetermined that is, casts a bad light on their family, or it's embarrassing, or, the archive that arrives at the archives may already have had some curation taking place by the family.
Yeah, and in terms of the Stephen Cogdell Sanders Venning album as well, I know some of the family members are not identified, but then you will. I mean, I know when I was working with that material, I thought I'd sort of, I had like the key, like, okay, there's some Venning sisters, they must, siblings look alike, and I would be like, okay, I figured it out. This is definitely, Sarah Venning versus, Miranda, and I'm like, no, I think I haven't, I think I've unlocked the key, and then I haven't. And so, these are and I must have, we've worked with family members who have identified some of the sitters, after giving us the collection, which has been really wonderful and helpful. But that also kind of continues to add to the, something, we don't, it's an album that's not only family members, but acquaintances. So is this an acquaintance or is this a family member? And that also kind of, changes your understanding and the dynamics. But this is my last thought. And then I will ask the specific question for Shawn to kind of, continue our conversation. I know, sometimes working with our patrons, and even myself, you have to make some kind, conjectures, right? You're making deductions based on the evidence you have in front of you. And so sometimes I say, they'll be like, well, do you think, that this is a possibility? Or, to XYZ. And it's like, well, no one has said it's not, no one has disproven this. So I don't think, I think you can make that conjecture, and that's, it's not wrong. That's not necessarily an imperfection, right? So just also in thinking about, working with these materials. So Shawn, if you would so indulge me, I'd like to ask a question specific to you, and then we will open it up for questions and answers. Questions, and please feel free to start at putting questions in the Q&A box at this point if you want. But my question for you, Shawn, and I think when we were kind of meeting about this roundtable previously, I was saying I have really your book Photography and the Color Line from 2004 really hit home for me, and I used it as a resource for one of my essays in the catalog that accompanies Imperfect History. And you talk about W.B. Du Bois's photographic archives of the Georgian Black community as situated somewhere between the institutional and vernacular, between determination and agency, because institutional archives cannot contain individuals. I think we've sort of been talking a little bit along this theme already, but I was wondering if you could just tease that out a bit more, because I would love to hear more of your feelings about that statement.
I think we have started to talk about that in relation to the Venning album in large part. But when I was working with the photographs that Du Bois compiled for what was called the American Negro exhibit at the 1900 Paris Exposition, I was really thinking about Du Bois as a social scientist. And he was working as a social scientist and a professor at Atlanta University at the time. And so, as a social scientist, he was also collecting materials for the 1900 exposition. And in collecting these photographs, he was in large part, I think, also collecting images that in their first instances were often portraits or family photographs. And that's not true of all 363 of the images, but a large portion of them, I'm imagining, in their first iteration were sentimental, intimate images just to be exchanged between family and friends. Things that would end up like in Benning's album, things, an album like that. And so Du Bois was collecting these images to bring them to Paris for a much broader international European audience, and also to bring them to Paris as evidence of African-American progress since the Civil War, right? And he was using even the language of science in calling, he titled some of the albums, Types of American Negroes, Georgia, USA. And he said explicitly that the images were there to disprove dominant misrepresentations of African Americans and to show this broader European audience, a more accurate view of African American accomplishment at this time. So I'm thinking then about, the albums as they are presented in Paris as signifying in this sort of double register, scientific on the one hand, but also sentimental and familial on the other hand. So in part, Erica, I think, that statement was really specific to the collection that I was working with at the time. But I do think that some of those same questions can be brought more broadly, especially if we're thinking about photographs in the 19th century. And Alan Sekula, in his important essay about 19th century photography, talks about photographic portraits as sort of functioning between two poles, one repressive and one honorific. And he's specifically thinking of repressive images like mugshots, so disciplinary, institutional mugshots, and then honorific portraits that might be family portraits or portraits of esteemed individuals on the other hand. And I guess I'm interested in the ways in which photographs kind of signify in between those two poles. And again, on the ways in which their meaning can change. The same image can mean vastly different things, given who is looking at it and for what purpose and when. So I'm interested in the way that images, get their meaning changes as they're recontextualized by viewers who bring their own priorities and perspectives to them.
Great, thank you, Shawn. So, again, like I said, opening up for questions, and we do have one in the Q&A at this point, so I'll ask that question, but please feel free to continue, to add questions. And this question is, and I think, could be to any one of us, did you encounter visuals that contradicted each other, leading to more questions than answers? Who wants to tackle that one?
Well, I was going to jump off of what Shawn had just mentioned, just in terms of this tension between like more repressive, forms of photography versus more honorific. And that instantly called to mind the photograph I'd shown earlier of the George Mark Wilson, and how that definitely, like, if you take into account the manuscript notes that he left behind, at least from a contemporary perspective, and a reading that's really paying attention to race, like, does fall in line with sort of how photography has been used across time to surveil, non-white people and to sort of regulate their bodies, from the point of, enslavement and colonialism up until today, as we know, like the mugshot and other forms of sort of voyeuristic photography. And so I thought that called that to mind. But then again, like, this isn't necessarily the object contradicting with another object, but I think contradicting with itself, given the fact that Wilson, in much of the archive of his work that we have, was very explicitly interested in architecture in Philadelphia. So if you take that perspective, then, you know, the object suddenly has these two conflicting readings. Like, on one hand, he really was just interested in documenting the changing architecture, documenting these buildings that he thought were unique or interesting for some reason, but then also was operating within a framework that allowed him to feel entitled to take photographs of people and their homes without their permission, because he was white and because they weren't. So that's one object that comes to mind when I kind of think of conflicting meanings and things that bring out more questions than answers, especially since we don't really have the woman's perspective besides what he has recorded in his notes. So there's a lot there.
Go ahead.
I agree. I just wanted to pick up on what Kanaya was saying, because I think that image really struck me, and especially, all of the notes that we have around it, right? And you would know this better than I do, because I've only had access to the digital sort of contextualization. But I was sort of interested in, the way apparently in his notes, Wilson says, that he had to cajole and convince her to be photographed, right? Like, her initial response was, no, I don't want any part of this, but he convinced her. And he did this by saying, we're interested in quaint houses and beautiful ladies, right? And there's kind of, his tone is sort of belittling her. I took it to be like, and that's how we convinced her to have her photograph made. And yet when I look at that photograph and look at her standing, right, behind the house and with her arms folded and facing the camera, like, she's standing there self-composed, and she's kind of a commanding presence at her home, right? And also sort of like at that gate, at a threshold kind of point between public and private. And there's a way in which, to me, like her stance and where she's standing, kind of reminds us that this is her space, right? And that to cross the threshold, so in this public domain, this white photographer, feels entitled and takes this image, but in order to enter her space, one would only do so, right, at her permission. So, there's a way in which, like, when I started to look at that photograph, I was like, is she kind of getting the last laugh here, actually? Like, is there a way in which her presence and the photograph can kind of be flipped and turned against the framing that Wilson gives us of this encounter?
I was going to say that of the George Mark Wilson photographs, of which the library company has, I think we have about 200 of them, the need to negotiate with the subject matter, I think that's the only image I can think of where that kind of text is something that Wilson writes, in his other encounters, because he was interested in sort of not just architecture, but also the ethnic groups that belong to different parts of the city and different ethnic neighborhoods. But I know that when he was photographing white people of different ethnicities than himself, he would often emphasize, how well people got along together, and would say something along the lines of, this is an Irish woman and a Syrian man. Doesn't it look like the old country? So it was just a very different sort of setup that I think that he had with people that he was approaching about taking photographs. The one that Kanaya is describing, and maybe Erica or Kanaya might want to correct me, but I don't recall any other sort of semi-hostile encounters, at least not that he records in any of the notes that he took about the photographs. That seems to be unique between him and the Black woman.
I believe there's one other image, and I could be mistaken, but I think it's of a family of African American. Like, I think there's some sons and a father, and he writes in the manuscript notes that the mother was present, but she didn't want to be photographed because she wasn't dressed appropriately or something. And so that was also another interesting moment. And it's, again, like, it's another woman who's sort of asserting her, right to be photographed and right to be captured in the way that she would like to be. And so that was another moment, but it wasn't necessarily like this moment of tension. It's just sort of, and in fact, she refuses to be, at least to my knowledge, she refuses to be in the image. And I think speaks to a similar sort of defiance that Shawn had described with the woman who did choose to be photographed. So yeah, it's these interesting moments that jump out like through these manuscript notes that Wilson certainly did not intend to, like, he could not have anticipated our reading of it. But I think it's so helpful that he left those behind, because it does add layer as time, like the layers get added as time goes on.
Well, you're just what you were saying just made me think too that, in some ways, Wilson's notes are also subjective, right? Like sort of like his reaction to, that conversation with the woman and her, so maybe, I assume it for the most part that, that's correct or a relay, but I know that I sometimes have had like uncomfortable conversations and I kind of keep thinking back to them, and it sort of sometimes they morph and become even more uncomfortable than they were maybe initially, or I kind of make it sound not as uncomfortable. So I'm wondering how much like Wilson is also sort of even with your notes, you might think like you're being completely honest, but there is a subjective take to it, and that you have to think about that as well as you're looking at the photograph and thinking what that interaction was between the sitter and between him. So yes, I think that's really great. So thank you. So I have another question for all of us. And it's, thank you for this excellent program. You're welcome. Can the panel address the challenges of curating with images that both contain complex visual information and also illustrate less directly the details behind their construction, production, for example, like printer, photographer, and publisher? Oh, I've got to say, that's if someone else wants, I have to like think about that for a moment. I don't know if others have like an initial. Oh, Sarah's unmuted, so go ahead, Sarah.
I don't think this is going to be the definitive answer, but it's just funny that someone brings this up, because I have been saying that it's bothering me a little bit that our exhibition labels ended up being so long in our exhibition. It's not bothering Erica at all, but and I think it was for the exact reason that our attendee just pointed out, the need to in some way describe what the content of the image is that's on the wall, but also to go beyond that to trying to place that image into these themes that we're discussing. Because, for example, a ticket for an invitation to a dinner of the Philadelphia Society of Etchers, it's a late 19th century ticket to a Philadelphia artist, needs a little bit of context as to what the Philadelphia Society of Etchers was and who the artist that was being invited to the event was. But also what I wanted, the reason that I selected that item for the exhibition was because of the graphic of the naked woman coming out of an ink bottle that was on the side of the invitation, which to me, the story of the invitation was the exclusion of women from the Philadelphia Society of Etchers, because they were excluded. And also that invitation would never have been sent to, I think, a group where both men and women were participating. It was very much a male-oriented invitation to a male-dominated event, and pointed out how women were excluded from the networks that would have potentially helped them in their path to be an artist. Because one of the founders of the Philadelphia Society of Etchers was Peter Moran, whose own sister-in-law was an etcher and an artist, and she could not have participated in the evening events. So to me, that became a longer label than normally I would have included with the invitation.
As Sarah was saying, like I've been joking that I don't mind the length of our labels because there are no books in our typically a library company exhibition because we are not only special collections of graphic materials but rare books as well, as that you have books and graphics, and this is the first exhibition in a long time that I can think of. It's just materials from the graphic arts department. So I've been joking like, well, the books in the exhibition are labels, and really they're not they are not too horrible. Boy, that sounds, boy, strike that. I do hope folks will come and read the labels, and even if you don't read the labels, I think you can get something out of the graphic materials themselves, because one of the points of this exhibition is close looking. So I mean, and again, you can have a different opinion than what we have written in a label. But I just also wanted to, there was a question that related back to the Wilson about are more of his notes in the exhibition. And I just wanted to indicate that the George Mark Wilson collection, which we had been talking about, we do have an online exhibition for those materials. And that does include the notes on the back of his photographs, because the online exhibition is also attached to they've been digitized and cataloged as part of our digital catalog. So it does include the manuscript notes on the back. So if you want to learn more about Wilson, you can go to our website, go to our digital catalog. You can search for the George Mark Wilson collection and you'll get access to that information that way. But yeah, no, thank you for that question. And thank you, Sarah, for that response. So it's about a 6:45, and I had like another question that I wanted to pose to us or to Shawn, and and this is sort of my own, and we've been sort of discussing this. But one of the threads in the exhibition is also that the visual culture of the past affects the visual culture of today, and how graphic photographs are read with cultural and racial biases. Do we think that there are any images that are immune to a racialized or culturally biased or influenced gaze? Yeah, I know it's a little bit of a I know. I'm thinking, like if you look at a picture of an apple, is I know it's a toughie. If everyone wants to take a pass, I can go on. Naya's brave. She's going.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is something that I, again, sort of as an outsider to a lot of the material in the collection, was often surprised about, was sort of how seemingly neutral objects and images can be still laden with like very, deeply troubling meanings. I think, seeing a lot of the trade cards, for instance, which, I mean, of course, to a contemporary viewer, like would read as overtly racist, but at the time that they were circulating, did not. And I think that is something that's really fascinating to see, the temporal aspect of like how images back then, again, were seemingly immune to like a racialized gaze, in the sense that people were not seeing them and they were internalizing the hierarchies that they were meant to convey, but they weren't seeing them in the way that we see them now as overtly derogatory. And so I often refer to like, oh, I would be surprised that I would see a racist ad for laundry soap, or and even if it wasn't overtly caricaturized, but just the inclusion of a Black person in a scene where they're in a service position, or standing, very clearly working for a white person, or even just, out in a field working, like the implications of that are were more subtle in the 19th century when this was really popular imagery. Whereas now we can understand, oh, these are racialized and these are racial caricatures being pushed forward in service of selling these products. So that's a counter to the question. I would say that I would argue no, like a lot of images are not, even the most innocuous things. But yeah, I would be curious to know everyone else's response.
Yeah, I mean, Erica, my initial my answer is no also. And so then, trying to tease out what that means, I think that visual culture is so much about looking relations, right? So it isn't only about representations, but it's very much about viewers, right? And how viewers are trained in their privileges about what can be looked at and what can be seen, who can be seen, who has the privilege to look and when. And so I think that all of those things, all of those dynamics, all of those lessons are learned in a cultural context that, is founded in a kind of racial bias. So I don't think that it is escapable. And so, when I'm thinking about visual culture, I'm, always thinking about representations, but then also about viewers, right? And, how it is that viewers are positioned, called out to, trained. And so when I'm looking at visual images, I'm thinking, about what is the intended subject of this, but then also who's the intended viewer here, and what does it mean if other viewers, outside of that intended viewer, have a look at this. I also, I was happy to hear that Tanya's blog, is also talking about the unseen. This is something that I have, spent a lot of time thinking about in my book, At the Edge of Sight, Photography and the Unseen, was very much involved in wrestling with, what is it that I'm seeing, particularly in a photograph, and what is it that I'm not seeing. I think photographs are also especially interesting because you can often tell sort of what the intended subject is. And then often there are unintended subjects, right? That, the photographer was focused on one thing and then, this person walked into the background, right? And so what does that unintended subject, tell us about the whole setup of, the framing of the image, the photographic encounter.
And I'm sorry, I will, Sarah, please feel free to jump in again, but I was just thinking, just thinking about like the, person coming into the background, like, maybe the photographer had like, his perfect setting and that was going to be the perfect image. And then this is like the imperfection that has been placed into it by you have the random person coming into the background, and how that has like, transformed it into a new and a different image. And it just maybe it was, because I'm thinking about our imperfection section in which, Sarah was talking about, and that, there are the material imperfections, but then there's the imperfections potentially in how it was, created or read, and that's a transformation sort of the image itself in and of our reading of it that I really appreciate, and that's why I kind of also appreciate our imperfection section. And I hope that, people not only are seeing, like I said, the material imperfections, which are not always imperfections in our mind, given the research value that they add, but I like to say it adds to like the life story of these prints and photographs, which I just think is so wonderful. It makes it such a rich story. So I have a few other questions. It's about 6:50. So let me see if we can get these in, and then I don't want, I know folks, it can be a long day. So we have some closing remarks, and I don't want to get people completely tuckered. But so one question is, which I think is more so if you'd be like to me and Sarah and Kanai, are there any images related to the Quaker history in Philadelphia? And I should be like, hey, I should know that off the top of my head, but I mean, I don't think, and I'm kind of looking towards Sarah and not, oh, Sarah, do you want to?
Yeah, I was trying to not catch your eye. I actually cannot think of anything that is explicitly about the Quaker influence in Philadelphia. I'm trying to think if anybody, I mean, there may be work by some Quakers in the exhibition.
Isn't it hard? I mean, it's funny, you're so intimate with those materials and writing the labels, but then you have these moments.
Right.
isn't the really large house that's photographed twice, once with a white family in front
Oh,
of it?
Clifton, this is back where I'm like being bad on my Quaker history of remembering who is yeah,
I was gonna ask, well, that seemed possible that I was gonna like these old colonial families, because I was also thinking of the Morris family. I don't know if they were Quakers, as well,
Yes.
because I have a couple of objects. Yes, there's
Yes.
Clifton, which belonged to the Chu family, and Samuel Chu was a lawyer during the colonial era, and very prominent in the revolutionary, in that revolutionary moment. And then the Morris family was also sort of a prominent Philadelphia family. And so we have a couple objects that deal with that history, and those families' relationships to slavery, and their place within sort of urban, or Philadelphia and its urban spaces. Clifton was the site of a revolution, of the Battle of Germantown, I'm pretty sure. And so there's some interesting ways in which that space is memorialized, and the way that the history of slavery is not necessarily accounted for. And then same with sort of the Morris family. They had some entanglements as
oh my
relating
God,
to
the
business.
Morrises are Quaker. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And they had business in the Caribbean specifically, and so and benefited from plantation slavery far further afield from the U.S. So that's some ways in which a little bit of the Quaker history gets to rear its head.
Tonight. And I'm just thinking like something that actually got removed from the exhibition, because we had like, again, trying to cram 300 years of history in, is that we did have a lithograph of a Hicksite Quaker meeting house, which was something that Sarah actually acquired for the collection in her first years as a curator, that I wanted to include, but unfortunately we did not have, we ran out of space for that. So that would have, I don't know if that's better or worse. So like there was another little something in there that had to get removed. But just getting back to some of the questions, and I'm just going to say it's a lovely comment before I might actually break my quarantine to see this thoughtful exhibition, but my question is about audience. You've purposely created a thoughtful exhibition. How are you attracting audiences who have not traditionally entered your exhibition space, the perennial issue for cultural institutions? And I'll try and answer that, quickly. I mentioned, because we are fortunate to have grant funding, and like when we were thinking about this exhibition, it was something we wanted to have a concept that we thought that we could get grant funding for, and the greatest hits exhibition wasn't gonna do that. So I've mentioned we have the digital catalog that is with multiple with guest catalogers from the studio arts profession, art historians, and curators. So I think that's an online presence that potentially, and through our blog post, can get folks to our door that might not necessarily come. We are having advertisements on our local WHYY, our public radio station. And I think that actually before exhibition even opened, like Wednesday of last week, we had a professor bring a group of students, like the labels weren't even up, came to see the exhibition. Cause I assume they probably heard it on WHYY, and it was like art students, they were doing like a collage class. So they came, so I must have been like, that's not completely a non-traditional, but that I don't know that's ever happened before. We've had folks actually come to look at the exhibition before it's even really up. I think we have a video on the exhibition that's also on YouTube at this point. So I think trying to have an kind of online, forward-facing online presence, initially to try to get folks who have not traditionally entered our exhibition space to come. So Sarah,
No, I was going to say, we were fortunate because of the Henry Luce Foundation funding that we were able to hire someone to do marketing for us, to do PR, and to have a little more money to put in those areas than we normally do. And of course, I can throw it back to all of you who are attending. We rely on you to spread the word.
Thank you, Sarah. So a couple more questions. What do you think the Imperfect History exhibition would say about curating now to people in the more distant future? I'll kind of address this quickly. I'm because another thought we had as we were conceiving of this exhibition, which I think is happening much more so in our field, is that I think, there was a thought that, museums, library, that we were neutral spaces. And I think, we now know that we are not neutral spaces, and we have to think about the historical and cultural biases that affect our collection. So not only the materials themselves, but how they came into our collections and how we are, mediating them. I think, the term that, that Kanaya was using. So, I mean, I think, and just by calling it imperfect history, I think it's an acknowledgement that potentially hasn't been acknowledged in the past about curation and curating. So I'm hoping that is what, people in the more distant future will take from this, that we were trying to have, we sort of talked about as like kind of as honest as, transparent look at the social dynamics and the biases that were affecting our collection. So I'm hoping that that's coming through, that, that we're trying to be, kind of honest with ourselves and with the materials themselves, and, kind of, and showing the rough edges and not trying to, trying to show those imperfections. If others, please feel free to jump.
Yeah, I would agree that, one of the goals of the exhibition is exactly what Erica said, was to show that Imperfect History, the exhibition, represents our take on this material, but it does not necessarily represent other people's take on it and what people in the future might think about it. It simply is us at this given moment in time trying to, as Erica said, be transparent about how we came up with these ideas, and a recognition of the biases that we bring to it, rather than pretending that, the label copy is the definitive answer of how you as a visitor should think about this material.
So we do have a couple more questions. I'm going to try and get them in, and folks will hang in. I know it's like, 7 o'clock. So maybe I'll just kind of like double them up. So if there are two final questions. In your research, did you discover any items that at one time you thought of as perfect and now see as imperfect? And then also, thanks for this great program. I'm curious about how working on this project has impacted what's on the horizon for the LCP's graphic arts collection, Ray, collection focus, interpretation, acknowledging bias, subjectivity in future projects. So I know I just sort of gave two out there. So please, if anyone wants to jump on those.
Well, I'm going to throw it to you, Erica, that maybe you want to talk a little bit about the recataloging or reconception of the African American collection.
Yeah. So this is also in thinking about our 50th anniversary, and actually working with a class at University of Delaware in 2017. I was fortunate for 20 years ago to catalog our African American history graphics collection. But those are now records that are over 20 years old. And during that class in 2017, even before that, I was starting to think like what these records need. It's time to review them and think about the subject headings being used, think about the descriptions, the language that is being used. And with this project, it really kickstarted like, hey, this is the time for us to really start to work on remediating those records. So we've been, looking at I've been fortunate to work, Kanaya worked on this project, and also one of my colleagues, Linda August, who's our curator of art and artifacts, but also our visual materials cataloger, has really been working on this project. We have over 1,000 records related to our African American history graphics collection. So looking at, you need to use standardized subject headings. They are, even the Library of Congress would admit that they've become outdated. So we're doing local headings to try and, not rectify, but, to have a more contemporary subject heading, so that an individual could be looking for the old subject heading, for instance, slave, as opposed to enslaved man or enslaved woman, which is, enslaved child, which is what we're using as well in our records. So, trying to, cover all the bases, so to speak. So that's something that has impacted us, and we're changing that. And I also just want to say, this was also influenced by one of our board members, I think very rightly so. At one point, it was like, can you call it African American history if it's like, these racist portrayals coming from the white person's perspective? Is that African American history? Which I really appreciated that challenge. And I must admit, that's an institutional decision. I can't just decide like we're no longer calling this our African American history collection or graphics collection, but that's also something that's in my mind and something thinking about changing. I'm hoping that I'll have like a race and visual culture digital collection as opposed to just an African American history graphics collection. So that's something thinking about changing as well. And also due to my colleague Linda and other events that have happened this year, thinking about Asian American history and the racism that has been occurring with that community this year, and potentially thinking of that that gap that's in our collection. Should we have more materials that are related to our local Asian American history, and have that as part of our collections, especially since the institution itself is trying to work, as are a lot of institutions trying to work on diversity, equity, and inclusivity. So that's also, sort of has worked at, the timing all kind of organically fit together. So yeah, I know it's a little after 7, and I don't think we were able to answer the thought of as perfect, now see as imperfect, but there's certainly materials in our collection that we do think in those terms. But I think it's time for me to sort of say, to wrap up the evening, and thank you so much, Dr. Shawn Michelle Smith, for joining us. And I think this was a convivial, insightful, really engaged conversation that I was hoping to have, and I'm so pleased. So I'm going to let Sarah has some closing remarks for those of you who are still sticking it out with us. And so I'm going to share the screen one last time and have Sarah give her last remarks.
And I promise I will keep them very short because I too would like to move on to my evening. I hope that everyone found our roundtable discussion as thought-provoking and engaging as I did. Thank you to Shawn Michelle Smith and to all of you for your participation. I hope that those of you who live in the Philadelphia area feel inspired enough by tonight's event to visit the gallery in person. The exhibition will be up through April 8th, 2022. For those of you who cannot do so, the online exhibition is scheduled to go live on October 18th. And as we may have mentioned, the online exhibition will have additional items that did not quite make it into the gallery. So I encourage everyone, including those of you who can visit the gallery in person, to make a visit to the virtual exhibition as well. Next slide. The themes of the exhibition and the history of the Graphic Arts Department are explored in more depth in this book of essays, which was delivered from the printer last week. The book is free, so this really isn't a hard sales pitch. All we are asking is that recipients cover the mailing costs. So if you're interested in ordering a book, please get in touch with Katie Maxwell at the email that you see, or give a call to the library company's main number. And finally, next slide. We are planning several more Imperfect History events, including a symposium on March 25th, 2022. And for more information about those events and to learn more about what Imperfect History has already accomplished, including some of the things we've mentioned, the digital catalog, and also we have held a visual literacy workshop the end of June. I encourage you to visit the website address that you see on the screen. And with that, I thank you once again for attending our roundtable and wish you all a very pleasant evening. Good night.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.